Hi, my name is Dave Younkin, and I'm the director of the lower school here at Friends Select. And today I'm going to be talking with one of our lower school teachers, Mira David, about academic discourse. One of the things we think about in the lower school is how conversation and class discussion can actually promote learning, because not all talk does promote learning, but done well, conversation and discussion in the classroom can really enhance and deepen the learning of the children that you're teaching. The other thing I'm excited to talk with Mira about is the fact that when it's done well, when classroom discussion is rich and where everybody's engaged in doing important thinking, it can allow the teacher to differentiate for kids all along the continuum of learning in their classroom. Mira, thanks for joining me for this conversation about academic discourse. I always love talking with you about teaching and learning, and I'm really always admiring like the way you engage kids in the classroom. I've told you that, I hope. And not just engage them, but how you get kids to think more deeply. And obviously talk is a part of that. I really do believe that not all talk leads to learning. And I just thought it'd be great to hear from you. You know, how do you react to that? Because there is, I think, talk that it fills the room, but it might not actually be doing what we need it to do. So what's your reaction to that? Does that sound too intense to say not all talk is something that leads to learning? Or
I think talk is a really critical part of the learning process.
yeah.
And I think that so many of us recognize in ourselves as adults that we process best through talk. And I think that the same can be said for how students process new information. And as the teacher, I try to think through how can I best support my students in having meaningful processing time to think through whatever the content is that we're learning, whether it's a book or a math lesson or getting ready to write.
How do you manage to get kids to process together and build together versus just call on one at a time and have
Yeah.
everything directed back to you?
Sure. I think part of the work of lower school is learning how to create an academic community. And I see a huge part of that is as being students learning how to listen actively to one another and respond in a meaningful way, whether that's in agreement or disagreement or sharing a connection to their learning. And so I think that in a classroom setting, we do a lot of work around learning how to have a conversation as a whole class rather than more of a Socratic, like teacher speaks, student answers. And I think that, I think it's commonly said that kids learn best from each other. And I think that's very true.
Right.
The less that the teacher talks, the more engaged the students tend to be.
Yeah.
And so I think that when teachers are working really hard to think through how they're going to facilitate discussion and how they're going to best set their students up to respond and to keep the conversation going, in my experience, it leads to more learning.
But I have seen in your classroom some of these kids who I know in this content area, they need a challenge. I mean, I was with one of your kids just yesterday who just retains so much information and is making so many connections in social studies, right? So how, what are your ideas about how that kind of dynamic conversation where everybody's listening and agreeing and adding on and making connections, how does that challenge some of those kids who need a challenge in that content area?
So I think a lot about open-ended questions and questions that don't have one right answer. Questions that might require somebody to think from a perspective that is not their immediate perspective, or think through an equity issue. do you agree that it's right to break the law? Do you disagree that it's never right to break the law? So I try to first start with my question, try to come up with something that like has a lot of different responses that could be supported through whatever it is that we're learning about. And then spend time thinking through how to set everyone up so that they can engage in the discussion. Because, you know, back to what we just talked about with processing, I think everybody needs time, whether you're somebody who retains a ton of knowledge or somebody who doesn't, thinking through how to kind of set everybody up to prepare for the discussion. And there are tons of different ways that we could do that. But then I think once everybody has had time to think through it, that's when you can have really great conversations.
Well, you did this the other day, I think. There's an example, right, of you doing this the other day that you were really excited about. And wasn't it about that that kind of big question about breaking laws?
Yeah, so we're learning about the Underground Railroad, and we read a book about Henry Box Brown, who famously shipped himself from the South to the North so that he could be free. And I posed the question of like, the people who helped Henry Box Brown broke the law in helping him. It was after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And I think universally, 100% of the class would have said like, yes, that was the right thing to do. But then, so that's not a very interesting discussion. But the question becomes a lot more interesting when you complexify it and you're asking, is it ever right to break the law? And so then I had all of the friends in my class go back to their seats and just collect their ideas. They just did a map or a web in their journals. Independently. And it was interesting walking around and just reading their writing. A lot of them started to shift into contemporary issues. Well, I know that it's illegal technically to, feed somebody, to dumpster dive. But what if you don't have enough food? Is that wrong to do it? So they started thinking about how that question could be applied to the current, to today. And then we had just such a rich discussion because they were really taking our conversation that was about a past event, and they were able to bring it into their lives today.
Well, it's interesting because you've been part of the professional development, like facilitating professional development on that kind of higher level thinking, right? I think we all appreciated the work we've done on Bloom's taxonomy, or in some circles they use a slightly different model that you learned about at the conference you went to for teaching gifted learners, the depths of knowledge, that sort of thing. But so that that story, you could have asked a question that was really just about recalling information or understanding, why people were, what people were doing and why they were trying to help Henry. But it sounds like you had kids that were, in your example, broadening it and applying it to current day situations. So that is a way to enrich a kid's thinking, right? Because application, isn't that one of the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy?
I think that any time that you're challenging students to think cross-curricularly and see how their learning can apply both across content areas within the classroom, but also just to the world around them, which is something that I think the lower school is really strong at doing just generally. I would argue that is enrichment. That's very challenging. It is a heavy cognitive load for students to lift, to really think outside of the confines of just this is English or social studies. I oftentimes find that those friends who are kind of named as being like the most advanced, it's hardest for them to change their minds about something. And so I usually don't let them share right away. I kind of like save them because we've spent the whole year kind of building this expectation that like when somebody's talking, you're listening to them, you're trying to think about what they're saying, not just think about your idea. And so like I call it like talk moves. So like I will try to challenge friends to engage in the conversation, but I might provide them with a way that I want them to start their sentence so that they can't just say what they had written down on the paper.
So an example that might be...
It might be, Dave, can you respond to what Catherine said? Or I noticed on your paper that you wrote something very different.
Yeah.
Like, what did you write?
I love that. Yeah. No, I love that. I was doing that the other day in a first grade where they were looking at the process for us getting our food, and we were just having a conversation about all the different steps along the way, right, from farm to our table. And at one point it was really fun to just say, well, so you all keep talking about how it has to go from the farm maybe to a factory, but then definitely to a distribution center. What if I said the distribution center wasn't important and we didn't have those? What would happen, right? And it is interesting because one of the kids who I think at a really young age prides himself on being super smart was really scratching his head and like trying to think like, what would we do? How could we manage getting food to people if you didn't have a distribution center? And did actually rely on some other people getting the conversation started, but then in the end he was able to say, here's how I think it could work if you didn't. But then he argued for the distribution center, and then we were back at reality, which is that these distribution centers are critical, right? But sometimes being a contrarian almost and saying, well, like, yeah, but is that always true? Or what if I said I don't agree with that? How would you convince me, right? Or well, that's a great example. I love that. I like to think about talk being accountable talk, and I know there's so many different ways that you could label something. It is academic discourse, right? But the idea that in our classroom, and I think you spoke to this, we're all accountable to the learning community, right? If someone shares an idea, you're expected to listen and respond to it, not just let it roll off your back. We're accountable to rigorous thinking, right? So the teacher's going to say, well, why do you think that? Or where did you learn that? Which is right away going to be something that like challenges kids to do deeper thinking. It's more rigorous. And then, accountability to using accurate knowledge, right? You probably have times where kids will share something and they'll assert their opinion or their thought, and you say, well, where'd you find that? Or maybe in your classroom, you even have kids that will say, like, that doesn't match what I... So just generally, as much as I know people sometimes say, well, why can't you just call it academic discourse? I love the idea of it being accountable talk, because when we hold people accountable to that kind of work in the classroom, I think it does enhance learning. So I wonder what your thoughts are on, like, in your classroom when there's this sense that we are all accountable, what does that generally do for the thinking in the classroom? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah, I mean, I really think that talk is connected to community. And I can think of countless examples in my own personal life where that's true, but I think that, in the classroom, as a teacher, we want our students to feel a part of something bigger. My actions affect everybody here. When I'm my best self, my classroom is a better place to be.
Yeah.
And I think that a huge part of that is how we talk to each other. And, there are so many jobs happening when we're at school. Kids are at school to develop relationships and to learn academic content. And I think that talk is just another part of that. And in a space where the focus is on developing respectful relationships, I just don't see how that can be disconnected from the way that students are learning how to listen and respond to one another. It's just like extremely interwoven.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I love that. When we're running a classroom and a discussion in a way that you just described, it is not just for kids who are interested and motivated to raise their hand who are participating, right? It's generally everybody. Some people call that equity of voices, which I think aligns with our values as a Quaker school. But how do you see this kind of talk aligning with our values versus talk that privileges people who process quickly and who are confident and who are extroverts, right? Because we have people that do process in a different way and aren't as confident and are quite possibly somewhere on the spectrum towards like introverts. So how does this align with our values in your opinion?
I think that, our school has this value of like teachers seeing the light in all of their students.
Yeah.
And I think that really knowing your students and thinking about how to design your day so that every student is able to access content in a way that fits for them is something that our school does really, really well. So for myself, I mentioned that we're doing this unit on the Underground Railroad, and we've been reading tons of books about the Underground Railroad and doing a lot of nonfiction informational writing about the Underground Railroad. But for some friends, that can be really challenging. Learning how to read a text and determine the main idea and supporting details, like that's work of fourth grade, but that's also work. And so in addition to doing informational writing, we do a lot of perspective writing. Imagine that you are a child and you live at a station house in the Underground Railroad. Write a letter to your cousin and explain to them how you're helping fugitives who are traveling to your home. Right? And so then that helps friends who maybe don't think in the same way as an informational paragraph, or maybe they do, and this is just a creative way for them to engage. Or yesterday, we started working on a project where in our classroom, they're going to create a map that shows the routes of the Underground Railroad, and we've been learning about different tools that fugitive slaves could use to help them. So next week, they're each going to choose one idea that they think is essential to understanding the Underground Railroad, and they're going to create an image and write a caption to explain it, and it's going to go on the map. So it's not like a huge in-depth project, but it's a way for them to show their learning and to process the information that they're gathering in different ways. And I think that, to me, that's a really big part of seeing all of my students. I have a friend in my class who he hates to participate. He does not like when I read his work. He does not want me to call on him. But he's an amazing artist, and he loves doing things like that. And so I think as a teacher, that's my job, is to know like what helps the kids in front of me learn, and it's my job to figure out how to bring that into the classroom and to not say that that's secondary to the curriculum. Like that has to become the curriculum if that's what they need.
I agree with you, and I love that you made that point, that I think sometimes we, as much as we're talking about discourse here, right? We're in this conversation privileging discourse as like, we're not privileging it. In this conversation, one could think we're saying that talk is the only way to show what you know, right? And I think I know which student you're talking about, and the idea of giving him a chance to codify his learning through an image or a beautiful drawing is perfect in terms of giving him entry in, and you could then ask him to stretch himself by participating in a conversation, but you've given him his way in and you've valued it
Right.
in a way that doesn't feel like just an add-on, but a real meaningful way to show what you know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to step outside of your classroom this time of the year, or this time of the year, if you were to step back and just look in on your classroom as they were having a discussion with a teacher, or if you were to look at your classroom now while you're having a discussion with them, what are some signs that that discussion is as rich and allowing entry, but also it's as rich and academically kind of challenging as you want it to be? Like, what would be? I think you've mentioned some of these signs earlier, but like, just as a recap, like, what would you say are some signs that that conversation is what you want and it's really promoting good learning?
I would want to hear very little from the teacher.
Yep.
I would want to...
Because the teacher has crafted this really good question, so they should be able to like release it to the group. Yeah, sorry.
I would want to have students' body language show that they're listening to one another. So that means that they're looking at the person who's talking. That if they're working with a shared text, that they are using the text, so like referring to it. I would want to hear them respond to one another. And then I would want there to be some place for their thinking to be made visible. I think that that's also really important.
Yeah.
So whether that's in formal writing, like complete sentence writing, or just some kind of graphic organizer.
Or jotting it on a Post-it note.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Those are really like the hallmarks that I would want to look for.
Yeah. Those are great. Can I add in, because I think you mentioned this earlier, hearing kids talk and hearing within that talk that their thinking might have changed based on what somebody else has shared. I love that with kids who, you mentioned earlier, sometimes the kids who consider themselves strong and actually are strong in an area, they lock in on their idea, and it's hard for them to be open to others' ideas affecting theirs. Some of that might be fixed mindset and that's a whole other conversation, but and if I have a fixed mindset about my intelligence, I quite possibly believe that it comes naturally. I don't have to work hard at it. It's just who I am. I'm smart, right? And if somebody else's idea challenges my idea, it feels big, right? It feels like maybe a threat to my esteem, like I'm not smart after all. So I do love that as a sign, right? That some kids' thinking has changed because of the conversation. Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, those are good signs.